Moving on to vitamin B12. Plants are not reliable vitamin B12 sources. And I want to go through them. Some foods are thought to be B12 sources, seaweed and algae especially. They contain both active B12 and inactive B12, what we call non-cobalamin cornoids and inactive non-cobalamin cornoids. So they look like B12, they attach to B12 receptor sites. And when you dry seaweed, you actually convert some of the active B12 into inactive B12. And so we just need to be aware of that as well. And so these foods, even though there are some like chlorella that may have more of the usable B12 and may be a reliable source, we only have 1 or 2 studies on 5 or 6 people. And so it's not, we can't yet say this is a solid, reliable source. Don't worry about anything else. So right now, I would say don't rely on seaweed. As a matter of fact, seaweed can actually contribute to a functional B12 deficiency, because what it does is you think you're getting the B12, you're getting these analogs attaching to receptor sites, so the real B12 can't get onto the receptor sites. So it's just to be aware of that. We need to make sure we have an alternative source of B12. Fermented foods like tempeh, black tea, or vegetables contain very little active B12. Now, it depends on where they're actually produced. So, for example, there was just a study from Indonesia that showed that there was a fair bit of usable B12 in their tempeh. Now, if you analyze the tempeh in the United States, not so much. Why? Because in the United States, the tempeh is made in stainless steel vats that are kept very clean. Whereas in Indonesia, they're doing them in old-fashioned wooden vats with the B12 producing bacteria in the wood, and they're not as clean. And so they get more B12 producing bacteria. And so it can be in some parts of the world a source, but it's not something you should actually rely on as a source. Organic vegetables contain very little, if any, active B12. If you ate the dirt and you used human manure to fertilize, you might get some B12, but it's not recommended. You might get some pathogenic bacteria as well. Mushrooms actually are minor B12 sources, but very minor. They might supply 5% of the RDA. Internal production, some people say if you eat properly, you'll produce enough internally. And actually, we all produce enough internally in our large intestine. The problem is we absorb most of the B12 in our small intestine, and things don't usually go backwards. So most of the B12 we make in our large intestine gets excreted in our stool. So we can't rely on internal production. And let's see. Vitamin B12 stores can last 2 to 3 years longer in adults. Many people, however, become deficient much more quickly. I've seen people become deficient within 6 months of adopting a plant-based diet. So it can happen more quickly in some people. Now, breastfed babies born to B12 deficient mothers can develop B12 deficiency within months of birth, and even sometimes within weeks of birth. And within months, they can develop very severe permanent brain damage. And this is for me, the saddest thing to see happen. It's completely unnecessary. Women who are giving birth need to make sure they have a source of vitamin B12 in their diets, because what happens when parents, ignore B12 and end up killing their baby because they've ignored B12 or causing severe brain damage is they end up in court and they end up going to jail. And I've been contacted on a number of occasions by lawyers saying, can you be an expert witness in this trial? And it is, it's just so devastating for the parents who went vegan because of all the right reasons, but didn't get well educated on what they needed to do. And we really need to make sure that doesn't happen, because when that hits the headlines, obviously nobody wants to see a child die or have permanent brain damage, of course, but also when that hits the headlines, it sets us back 20 years, because it becomes exhibit A for why people are justified eating their meat. This is what's going to happen if you're vegan. And people sit up and take notice. So we need to take care of that. B12 deficiency symptoms, you start out with megaloblastic anemia. And of course, megaloblastic anemia, you get all the typical signs of anemia: fatigue, weakness, irritability, all that sort of stuff. And then nerve and brain damage. And the first thing that happens here is you get numbness and tingling in your extremities. If you've ever experienced that, it can be caused from a number of things, but B12 deficiency is probably one of the common causes of numbness and tingling in your extremities, the tips of your fingers, the tips of your toes, even the tip of your nose. And so that's the first sign of the nerve damage happening. The next sign could be difficulty walking, and then eventually you get brain damage and psychosis and death. So that's kind of the order of things in terms of B12 deficiency. You can get gastrointestinal disturbances like a sore stomach, diarrhea, basically lack of appetite. And then the other thing that happens is your homocysteine goes up. And when homocysteine goes up, it increases your risk of birth defects, it increases your risk of Alzheimer's disease, and it increases your risk of heart disease. So it's like shooting yourself in the foot as a vegan to ignore B12, because you are counteracting the benefits of a plant-based diet. So we just don't want to do that. So what is the recommended dietary allowance for B12? It's about 2.4 micrograms a day for adults, a little more during pregnancy and lactation. How much do we actually consume? Well, look at this. Is the Adventist Health Study too. Non-vegetarians, lacto-ovo-vegetarians, and vegans all consume the same amount, which is quite interesting. Adventist Health Study, they know about B12. The Adventists tend to know about B12 and take care of it. They eat fortified foods, or they take supplements, or whatever they're doing. In Epic Oxford, we saw something very different. So non-vegetarians, about 8.2, lacto-ovo, around the 3, vegans, not even 1 microgram a day. So what's expected there? Well, you can imagine. You know, we see suboptimal B12 status in the Adventist Health Study too, fairly low rates for omnivores and vegans, but in Epic Oxford, we saw either suboptimal levels or, deficient or depleted in 73% of the vegans. So that needs to end. We need to figure out how to solve that problem. So why the differences? Well, in North America, there's greater use of B12 supplements and B12 fortified foods than there is in the UK generally. So one of the things, we just don't want to mess with B12. Vegans, vegetarians, and everyone over the age of 50 needs to ensure reliable sources. Of course, everyone needs to get reliable sources of B12, but they also need to regularly monitor their B12 status. Just know where you're at. So why everyone over 50? Well, everyone over 50, the Institute of Medicine recommends that everyone over 50 get their B12 from supplements or fortified foods, just like vegans. And that is because vitamin B12 is bound to protein in animal products. And in order to cleave the B12 off of the protein it's bound to, you need enough stomach acid and you need enough production of enzymes to cleave it off. And as you get older, that production can wane and you may not be able to get the B12 from the animal foods. So it's estimated about 10 to 30% of people over 50 can't do a good job at getting the B12. So the Institute of Medicine just says everyone over that age should rely on fortified food supplements for their B12. So how much is enough? Well, remember it was 2.4 micrograms a day, but what we see is that at that level, some people, their homocysteine still goes up, and we want to keep homocysteine down. So we recommend from supplements 1,000 micrograms 2 or 3 times a week, or 25 to 250 micrograms a day. And if you're getting your B12 from fortified foods, about 2 servings a day with about 4 to 10 micrograms per serving. So what are reliable sources? Well, for vegans and lacto-ovo-vegetarians, supplements, fortified foods, and of course for additional sources for lacto-ovo-vegetarians who are under 50, animal products like dairy and eggs could provide some B12. So let's look at the amounts in plant-based foods. What you see is meat analogs contain about 1 to 8.5 micrograms per serving, ready-to-eat cereals around 1 to 6, non-dairy milks around 0.6 to 3, nutritional yeasts like vegetarian support formula about 4 micrograms per heaping tablespoon, and compare that to the animal products. Whoops, sorry about that. We're seeing very similar amounts in a serving of animal product. So just so you know, you can get plenty in fortified foods. It's hard though, if you're eating a whole food plant-based diet, you might not be using so many fortified foods. A lot of people do use the non-dairy milks and the nutritional yeast though, and those are excellent sources.